Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for nearly 2 decades, and in that time he had developed what he thought was an unshakable professional composure. He had handled every conceivable situation with his signature blend of humor and heart, from hilarious wrong answers to tearful family reunions, from surprise proposals to emotional tributes. But on that mild December afternoon in 2025, a 96-year-old man named Robert Mitchell would reveal a secret so devastating, so morally complex, and so emotionally overwhelming that Steve would be literally unable to speak, standing frozen on stage with tears streaming down his face, while the oldest contestant in the show's history unburdened himself of a truth he had carried for 74 years. 2 families stood ready to compete, the Davidson family from Georgia and the Mitchell family from Pennsylvania. The Mitchell family immediately captured everyone's attention because at their center stood Robert Mitchell, an extraordinarily alert 96-year-old man with piercing blue eyes, thick white hair, and a military bearing that age had not diminished. He wore a navy blue blazer with an American flag pin, moved with careful dignity despite his walker, and had a quiet intensity that suggested depths beneath his polite, soft-spoken exterior. His family surrounded him with obvious devotion, 4 generations including his daughter who was in her early 70s, his grandchildren in their 40s and 50s, his great-grandchildren who were teenagers and young adults, and even one great-great-grandchild, a toddler who kept reaching for his great-great-grandfather's hand. During the pre-interview, Robert had been reserved but cordial, mentioning briefly that he was a World War II veteran who had served in the Pacific, that his wife of 68 years had passed away 2 years earlier, and that being on the show with his family was something his late wife had always wanted him to do. The Mitchell family won their game with solid teamwork, though Robert contributed quietly, seeming distracted and distant even as his family celebrated around him. As they lined up for fast money, Robert's daughter Patricia gently suggested that perhaps her son should play instead of Robert, worried that the excitement might be too taxing for someone his age. But Robert shook his head with surprising firmness and said in a voice that carried unexpected steel, "I need to do this. I came here to do this." Something in his tone made Patricia step back, and Robert's grandson went first, scoring 186 points, which meant Robert needed only 14 points to win the $20,000. It should have been effortless, nearly impossible to lose, but as Robert approached the podium, gripping his walker with hands that shook visibly, Steve noticed that tears were already streaming down the old man's face. Not tears of joy or excitement, but deep, wrenching tears that spoke of profound anguish. Steve's professional smile faded immediately, replaced by genuine concern as he approached Robert and asked gently, "Sir, are you all right? Do you need to sit down for a minute?" Robert shook his head and said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried clearly in the silent studio, "No, Mr. Harvey. I need to stand here and I need to say something before we play this game, because if I win this money without telling the truth first, I'll have won it under false pretenses, and I can't do that. I can't take one more thing into eternity based on a lie." The studio went completely silent with that heavy, expectant quiet that happens when people sense something momentous is about to occur. Steve's face showed confusion mixed with deep concern, and he glanced at the producers who were equally bewildered. But something in Robert's expression, a combination of desperate determination and unbearable pain, made Steve nod slowly and say, "Okay, sir. Whatever you need to say, we're listening." Robert looked at his family, his eyes moving over each beloved face, then turned to address the audience and cameras. His next words would render Steve Harvey completely speechless, would stop the show entirely, and would ultimately force everyone watching to grapple with impossible questions about war, morality, survival, and the secrets that veterans carry. Robert said, his voice shaking but clear, "My name is Robert Mitchell, I'm 96 years old, and I am not the hero my family thinks I am. I received a Bronze Star for valor during World War II, and for 74 years, everyone has believed I earned it by saving my fellow soldiers under enemy fire. That's what the citation says, that's what I've let everyone believe, and it's a lie. I didn't save those men, I killed them." The gasps that tore through the studio were immediate and visceral, shock rippling through every person present. Steve Harvey's face went completely white, his mouth opened as if to speak but no sound came out, and he simply stood frozen, unable to process what he had just heard. Robert's family looked stunned, his daughter Patricia's hand flying to her mouth, his grandchildren stepping back in visible shock, and his great-grandchildren looking confused and frightened by the sudden terrible tension. Robert continued, tears now flowing freely down his weathered face. I need to tell the truth about what happened in the Philippines in 1945. I need to tell what I did, and I need to do it before I die because I can't face whatever comes after death carrying this lie one more day. The story Robert began to tell took everyone back to March 1945, to the Philippines where American forces were engaged in brutal combat with Japanese troops in the final months of the Pacific War. Robert had been 20 years old, a private in the Army, part of a unit fighting through dense jungle in conditions that were nightmarish, extreme heat, constant rain, disease, and an enemy that fought with desperate ferocity, knowing they were losing the war. Robert's voice was steady despite his tears as he described the particular mission that would define and haunt the rest of his life. His unit, 12 men, had been sent to secure a small village that intelligence suggested was being used as a Japanese staging area. They had approached at dawn, moving carefully through the jungle. When they had walked into an ambush, Japanese soldiers had opened fire from concealed positions, and in the chaos of the firefight, Robert's unit had taken heavy casualties immediately. Within minutes, 6 men were dead, and the remaining 6, including Robert, had scrambled for cover behind a fallen tree and some rocks, pinned down by enemy fire and unable to retreat or advance. Robert paused, his hands gripping the podium so tightly his knuckles were white, and Steve still hadn't moved or spoken, simply standing there with tears running down his face, his expression showing horror and incomprehension. Robert continued, we were trapped there for hours, taking sporadic fire, watching the jungle around us, knowing the Japanese were positioned on 3 sides, and that if they decided to overrun our position we'd all be killed. By mid-afternoon, several of us were wounded, including our sergeant who was the ranking soldier. We were running low on ammunition, we had no radio contact because our radio operator was one of the first killed, and we knew we were in serious trouble. Robert's voice dropped even lower as he said, then one of our guys, a private named Danny Walsh from Brooklyn, he started panicking. He was 19 years old, it was his first real combat, and he was terrified. He started talking about surrendering, about standing up with our hands raised, about how the Japanese would take us prisoner and at least we'd be alive. Our sergeant told him that was suicide, that the Japanese weren't taking prisoners in that phase of the war, that surrendering meant execution, but Danny was beyond reason. He was crying and shaking and saying he couldn't take it anymore, that he'd rather surrender than die slowly waiting for them to attack. The studio remained absolutely silent, everyone transfixed by this story from 80 years ago. Robert continued, his voice now barely audible, but still clear in the profound quiet. Our sergeant tried to calm Danny down, tried to keep him quiet because his panic was affecting the other men, but Danny kept getting louder and more hysterical. Then Danny did something that put all of us in immediate danger. He stood up, preparing to walk out with his hands raised, shouting in broken Japanese that he wanted to surrender. If he had done that, the Japanese would have known exactly where we were positioned, would have known how many of us there were, and how desperate our situation was, and they would have attacked immediately and killed all of us. Our sergeant made a split-second decision. He grabbed Danny and tried to pull him back down behind cover, but Danny was fighting him, still screaming, completely hysterical, and in the struggle our sergeant's rifle discharged. The bullet hit Danny in the chest, and he died almost instantly. Robert paused, and the horror on Steve Harvey's face deepened, but Steve still seemed unable to speak, standing there with his hand pressed against his mouth, tears streaming down his face. Robert said, the gunshot and Danny's screaming had given away our position, and the Japanese immediately opened fire on us with everything they had. In that barrage, our sergeant was killed, shot through the head, and 2 other men in our unit were seriously wounded. That left 3 of us still combat effective, me and 2 other privates named Jimmy Chen and Marcus Jackson. We knew we had maybe minutes before the Japanese overran our position, and we made a desperate decision. We decided to try to fight our way out, to make a run for it under covering fire, hoping we could get far enough into the jungle to lose them or find our way back to American lines. Robert's voice broke as he continued, but we had 2 wounded men, and they couldn't run. They begged us not to leave them, said if we left them the Japanese would find them and kill them or worse. Jimmy, Marcus, and I, we had a choice to make. We could stay and die with them, we could try to carry them, which would slow us down and probably mean we'd all die. Or we could leave them. We chose to leave them. The collective gasp from the audience was audible, and several people could be heard crying. Robert's daughter Patricia had sat down on the stage floor, her face buried in her hands, and his grandchildren looked horrified. Robert continued relentlessly, but we didn't just leave them. We knew that if the Japanese found them wounded, they might torture them for information or execute them slowly. So Jimmy, Marcus, and I made a decision that has haunted me every day for 74 years. We killed them. We shot our own wounded soldiers to prevent them from falling into enemy hands alive, and then we ran. We made it out of that jungle, made it back to American lines, and we reported that our unit had been ambushed and that everyone else was killed in combat. We never mentioned that our sergeant had accidentally shot Danny Walsh during his panic attack, and we never mentioned that we had deliberately killed our 2 wounded comrades. We let everyone believe they had all died from enemy fire, and the 3 of us agreed to never speak about what really happened. Steve Harvey finally found his voice, though it was shaking and barely above a whisper. He said, "Mr. Mitchell, why did you receive a Bronze Star if this is what happened?" Robert's face crumpled with fresh anguish as he answered, "Because when we made our report, we lied about the circumstances. We said that we had held off a much larger Japanese force, that we had fought heroically to protect our wounded comrades, and that we had only retreated when they were all dead and we were out of ammunition. The lie made us look like heroes when we were actually cowards and killers. I received a Bronze Star for valor, Jimmy Chen received a Silver Star, and Marcus Jackson received a Bronze Star. We were celebrated, promoted, given medals, treated like heroes who had survived terrible odds. And for 74 years, I've worn that Bronze Star and let people thank me for my service and call me a hero, all while knowing that I'm actually a man who killed his own wounded comrades to save himself." Patricia finally spoke, her voice thick with tears and shock. "Dad, are you saying you murdered your own soldiers? Your own unit?" Robert looked at his daughter and said, "Yes, Patricia, that's exactly what I'm saying. We told ourselves we were doing them a mercy, preventing them from being tortured or executed by the Japanese, but the truth is we killed them so we could escape. We prioritized our own survival over staying with our wounded comrades, and we killed them to make our escape easier. That's murder, even if it happened in a war zone, even if we had reasons we told ourselves justified it. I've carried that truth for 74 years, and I've let you and everyone else believe I'm a war hero when I'm actually a man who shot his own wounded friends in the back and then lied about it." Steve finally moved, approaching Robert slowly, his face showing a complicated mixture of horror, compassion, and complete bewilderment about how to respond to this confession. He said, his voice still shaking, "Sir, I need to ask, why are you telling us this now? Why here? Why after 74 years? Robert looked at Steve with eyes that held more than 7 decades of guilt and said, "Because I'm 96 years old, Mr. Harvey, and I'm dying. I have congestive heart failure, and my doctors say I probably won't live to see another Christmas. And I realized I can't die with this secret, can't go to my grave letting my family believe I'm a hero, can't face my wife in whatever comes after death while still carrying this lie. I've worn this Bronze Star my whole life. I've been thanked for my service at every Veterans Day event. I've been honored and respected and treated like I did something brave when what I actually did was cowardly and murderous. I need my family to know the truth about who I really am. I need to acknowledge what happened to Danny Walsh and those 2 wounded soldiers whose names were Thomas Rivers and Andrew Kowalski, and I need to finally take accountability for what I did even though it's 74 years too late." One of Robert's grandsons, a man in his 40s named David, stepped forward and said in a voice full of anger and confusion, "Grandpa, you're telling us you killed American soldiers. You shot your own men and then lied about it for 74 years. How could you live with that? How could you accept medals and honors knowing you didn't deserve them?" Robert nodded, accepting his grandson's anger, and said, "I don't know how I lived with it, David. I compartmentalized it, I buried it, I told myself that war was chaos, and that I had made an impossible choice in impossible circumstances, and I tried to balance the scales by being a good man in every other area of my life. I was a good husband to your grandmother, a good father to your mother and her siblings, a good grandfather and great-grandfather to all of you. I volunteered with veterans organizations, I helped younger veterans dealing with PTSD, I donated to military charities, all while knowing that nothing I did could erase what I had done in that jungle in 1945. I thought maybe if I lived a good enough life for long enough, I could somehow make up for it, but I was wrong. You can't atone for killing your own wounded comrades by being nice to your grandchildren or volunteering at the VA hospital. The debt is unpayable, and the only thing I can do now is tell the truth and face whatever consequences come from that." Steve asked, his voice still shaky, "Mr. Mitchell, what about the other two men, Jimmy Chen and Marcus Jackson? Did they carry this secret too?" Robert nodded and said, "Jimmy died in Korea in 1951, killed in action, and I've always wondered if he put himself in danger because he was carrying the same guilt I was carrying, if he was looking for a way to die that felt more honorable than living with what we did. Marcus lived until 2003, and I saw him at a reunion in the 1990s. We didn't talk about what happened, didn't acknowledge it, just looked at each other and understood that we were both still carrying it. After he died, his son sent me a letter saying that Marcus had confessed on his deathbed to killing those wounded soldiers, that he had told his family the truth before he died, and that his family had struggled to process it, but ultimately forgave him. That letter is what made me realize I needed to tell my family too, but I was a coward for 20 more years, and it's only now when I'm dying that I finally found the courage." Patricia spoke again, her voice broken. "Dad, what do you want from us? What do you expect us to do with this information?" Robert looked at his daughter with infinite sadness and said, "I don't expect anything, Patricia. I don't expect forgiveness, I don't expect understanding, and I wouldn't blame any of you for wanting nothing to do with me after learning this. But I needed you to know the truth before I die, needed to stop being honored as a hero when I'm not one, and needed to make sure that Danny Walsh, Thomas Rivers, and Andrew Kowalski are finally acknowledged for how they really died rather than having their deaths remain hidden behind my lie. Those 3 men have families somewhere, descendants who believe their father or grandfather died heroically in combat, and they deserve to know that the truth was more complicated and more terrible than that. I'm hoping that by telling this story publicly, maybe it will reach their families somehow, and they can finally know what really happened to their loved ones." Steve Harvey, who had been standing silently trying to process everything, finally turned to the camera and said, his voice still thick with emotion, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what to say right now. This is beyond anything I've ever dealt with, and I need to stop the show. This isn't a game show situation anymore. This is a confession of something that happened during wartime that involves moral complexity I can't even begin to understand. I need to think about what our responsibility is here." He looked at Robert and said, "Sir, I need to ask you something important. Have you spoken to military authorities about this? Could there be legal consequences for you from making this confession?" Robert shook his head and said, "I've consulted with military lawyers, Mr. Harvey. What I did happened 74 years ago during active combat in a war that's long over. The men I killed were already dying, we were under extreme circumstances, and even if military justice wanted to pursue charges, I'm 96 years old and dying, and prosecuting me would serve no purpose beyond punishment. But more importantly, I don't care about legal consequences anymore. I care about moral consequences, about standing before whatever judgment comes after death, and about my family knowing the truth about who I really was." The producers called a halt to production while lawyers and military consultants were brought in to advise on how to handle Robert's confession. Over the next several hours, with cameras still rolling but the game show completely abandoned, Robert told his full story in excruciating detail. He described the faces of Danny Walsh, Thomas Rivers, and Andrew Kowalski, remembered their last words, recalled the weight of the decision to kill them, and explained the 74 years of guilt that had shaped every day of his life since. He talked about nightmares that had never stopped, about the times he had almost confessed to his wife but had chickened out, about wearing his bronze star at military events while feeling like a fraud, and about the relief mixed with terror he felt now that he had finally spoken the truth aloud. His family sat with him through all of it, their faces showing shock, grief, anger, confusion, and underneath it all, love for the man they had known their entire lives, even as they struggled to reconcile that man with this shocking revelation. Patricia eventually spoke, saying through her tears, "Dad, I don't know how to process this. You're telling me you did something terrible in war, something that you've hidden your whole life, and now I have to figure out who you really are. But I need you to know something. You were a good father. You were kind and loving and patient. You taught me right from wrong. You were there for every important moment of my life, and you've been an amazing grandfather and great-grandfather. I don't know if those things make up for what you did in 1945, but they matter. You matter. And I don't know if I can forgive you for what you did or for lying about it for 74 years, but I know I love you, and I'm not going to abandon you now when you're dying, even if I'm angry and confused and devastated by what you've told us." The decision about what to broadcast was extraordinarily difficult and controversial. Some argued that Robert's confession should not be aired because it was too disturbing, because it might dishonor military service, or because it involved admissions of killings, even if those killings happened in wartime. Others argued that the confession was newsworthy, that it illuminated the moral complexities of war and the psychological toll on veterans, and that Robert had made the confession publicly with the clear intention of having it broadcast. After extensive legal review, consultation with military historians and ethicists, and discussions with Robert and his family, a decision was made to air a heavily edited special that included portions of Robert's confession, extensive historical context about combat in the Pacific Theater and the moral dilemmas soldiers faced, expert commentary about battlefield ethics and impossible choices, and clear framing that what Robert described was an extreme situation that should not be taken as representative of military service generally. The special that eventually aired included powerful content warnings, resources for veterans dealing with moral injury and PTSD, and was framed very carefully to avoid either glorifying or excessively condemning Robert's actions. Military historians explained the brutal nature of combat in the Pacific, the fact that soldiers were sometimes forced to make terrible choices in extreme circumstances, and the concept of battlefield mercy killings, which, while controversial and officially prohibited, had occurred throughout military history when soldiers believed leaving wounded comrades to enemy capture was worse than killing them. Psychologists discussed moral injury, the particular form of trauma that comes from perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent actions that violate one's moral code, and how veterans who carried such injuries often suffered for their entire lives, even when they never spoke about what they had done or witnessed. The response to the special was intense, divided, and generated enormous controversy. Some viewers, particularly veterans and military families, were outraged, feeling that Robert's confession dishonored military service and gave ammunition to those who wanted to portray all soldiers as murderers, or who wanted to condemn the military generally. They argued that Robert should have taken his secret to the grave, that confessing 74 years later served no purpose except to ease his own conscience at the expense of military reputation. Others, particularly those interested in the psychological costs of war, praised Robert for his honesty and saw his confession as an important illustration of the moral complexities of combat and the lifelong burden that veterans sometimes carried. They argued that acknowledging the terrible choices soldiers sometimes faced was more honest than pretending war was clean, and that all military actions were heroic. Mental health professionals and veterans advocates used Robert's story to discuss moral injury and the importance of creating spaces where veterans could acknowledge difficult truths about their service without fear of judgment or legal consequences. They pointed out that many veterans carried similar burdens, secrets about things they had done or witnessed or failed to prevent during combat, and that the inability to speak about these experiences contributed to high rates of suicide, substance abuse, and PTSD among veterans. Some called for changes to how military service was honored, suggesting that thanking veterans for their service should include acknowledgement that service sometimes involved morally complex situations, and that honoring veterans meant accepting their full humanity, including their struggles and mistakes, not just celebrating an idealized version of heroism. Robert lived for 6 more weeks after the broadcast aired, dying in January 2026, just short of his 97th birthday. In those final weeks, he received thousands of letters, emails, and messages from people responding to his confession. Some were hateful, calling him a murderer and a coward who didn't deserve to be buried with military honors. Others were supportive, thanking him for his honesty and sharing their own stories of carrying moral burdens from military service or other extreme situations. Several messages came from people who identified themselves as descendants of Danny Walsh, Thomas Rivers, or Andrew Kowalski, the 3 men Robert had admitted to killing. These messages were varied, some expressing anger and betrayal that their family member's death had been hidden and lied about, others expressing a complicated kind of gratitude for finally knowing the truth about what had happened, even though that truth was terrible. One letter in particular affected Robert deeply in his final days. It came from a woman named Margaret Walsh, who identified herself as Danny Walsh's younger sister, now 93 years old. She wrote that she had been 11 years old when her brother died, that the family had been told he died heroically in combat, and that learning the truth 74 years later was devastating, but also strangely clarifying. She wrote that she had always wondered why Danny's death had affected their mother so differently than other Gold Star mothers seemed affected, why their mother had seemed angry in addition to grief-stricken, and why she had sometimes said things about Danny being too gentle for war, that suggested she blamed the army for putting him in situations he couldn't handle. Learning that Danny had panicked, had tried to surrender, and had been shot by his own sergeant during that panic helped Margaret understand her mother's complicated grief and also helped her understand her brother better, seeing him as a terrified 19-year-old who broke under unbearable pressure rather than as an abstract hero. She wrote that while she was angry Robert had lied for 74 years, she was grateful he had finally told the truth, and she forgave him because holding on to anger at a 96-year-old dying man served no purpose. Robert read this letter over and over in his final days, and he asked his family to contact Margaret and thank her for her forgiveness, which he said meant more to him than anything else that had come from his confession. Robert's funeral was held with full military honors, a decision his family made despite the controversy, arguing that whatever he had done in one terrible moment in 1945, he had served his country for years, including in other combat situations where he had acted honorably, and that his military service deserved recognition even as his actions on that one day deserved condemnation. The funeral was attended by both supporters who saw Robert as a brave truth teller and detractors who saw him as a confessed killer who didn't deserve honors. Patricia gave a eulogy that captured the impossible complexity of her feelings, saying, "My father was a good man who did a terrible thing during war, and then lived for 74 years carrying the weight of that terrible thing, while also living a good life filled with love and service to others. I don't know how to reconcile those two truths, and I don't think anyone else does either. What I know is that he was my father, that he loved his family fiercely, that he tried to be a good person even while carrying unbearable guilt, and that at the end of his life he found the courage to tell a truth that he could have taken to his grave. I don't know if that confession redeemed him or condemned him further, but I know it was honest, and I know it cost him everything to speak it. That's all I can say about a man I loved and now understand I never fully knew." Robert's Bronze Star was not revoked, as military authorities determined that investigating combat actions from 74 years ago based on a deathbed confession was not practical or appropriate, particularly given the extreme circumstances Robert had described and his subsequent decades of service to the veteran community. However, Robert had requested in his will that the Bronze Star be returned to the military or displayed in a museum with full context about the circumstances under which it was awarded, and his own later admission that the citation was based on false reporting. His family honored this wish, donating the medal to the National WWII Museum with a detailed account of Robert's confession and the circumstances he described, ensuring that his story would be preserved as part of the complicated historical record of World War II combat. Steve Harvey spoke about the experience frequently in the years that followed, calling it the most morally complex and emotionally devastating situation he had ever faced as a host. He said that standing there listening to Robert's confession, being literally unable to speak for several minutes, because the weight of what he was hearing was so overwhelming, had changed him and had changed how he thought about war, heroism, guilt, and the stories veterans carry. He defended his decision to let Robert speak his full truth and to facilitate the broadcast of his confession, arguing that while the content was disturbing and controversial, there was value in acknowledging the moral complexities of war and in giving veterans space to speak difficult truths. He also acknowledged the criticism that the show had provided a platform for someone to confess to killing American soldiers, and he wrestled publicly with whether that had been the right choice or whether he should have stopped the confession immediately. The broader conversations sparked by Robert's confession were extensive and ongoing. Military ethicists debated the question of battlefield mercy killings and whether there were circumstances under which killing one's own wounded comrades could be considered morally justified. Veterans organizations struggled with how to respond, with some condemning Robert and others defending him, or at least acknowledging the impossible position he and his unit had been in. Historians of World War II noted that Robert's story, while extreme, was probably not unique, and that the Pacific Theater in particular had involved numerous situations where American soldiers made terrible choices under extreme pressure, choices that often went unreported and that survivors carried silently for their entire lives. Mental health professionals emphasized that Robert's story illustrated the concept of moral injury, the psychological damage that comes from perpetrating or witnessing acts that violate one's moral beliefs, even when those acts occur in contexts like war where moral complexity is inherent. They used Robert's confession to advocate for better mental health support for veterans, for creating spaces where veterans could process moral injuries without fear of judgment, and for acknowledging that supporting veterans meant accepting their full humanity, including the difficult things they might have done or witnessed during service. Some argued that Robert's 74 years of hidden suffering illustrated exactly why veterans needed to be able to speak about moral injuries, because carrying such burdens in silence for decades was psychologically devastating and contributed to the high rates of suicide and mental health struggles among veterans. The families of Danny Walsh, Thomas Rivers, and Andrew Kowalski had varied responses to learning the truth about their relatives' deaths. Danny Walsh's family, through his sister Margaret, expressed complicated gratitude for finally knowing the truth, while also grieving the loss of the heroic narrative they had believed for 74 years. Thomas Rivers' family was more angry, feeling that Robert's confession had dishonored their grandfather's memory and robbed them of the comfort of believing he had died in combat rather than being killed by his own comrades. Andrew Kowalski's family was divided, with some members wanting to investigate further to determine if Robert's account was accurate and others preferring to let the matter rest rather than digging into painful history. All three families struggled with the question of how to remember their loved ones now that they knew the circumstances of their deaths were different than they had believed, and with whether learning this truth 74 years later was a gift or a curse. In the end, Robert Mitchell's confession on Family Feud became a story about the moral complexities of war, the lifelong burden of guilt, the question of when confession serves healing and when it serves only the confessor's need for absolution, and the impossible dilemmas that soldiers sometimes face in combat. It forced uncomfortable conversations about what heroism really means, about whether medals and honors accurately reflect the complicated realities of military service, and about how society should relate to veterans who carry moral injuries from their service. It challenged simplistic narratives about war and heroism, forcing acknowledgement that combat sometimes involves terrible choices with no good options, that soldiers are human beings who make mistakes and carry lifelong consequences, and that honoring military service should include space for acknowledging these complexities rather than insisting on idealized narratives. Robert's story also raised questions about confession and accountability. Was his deathbed confession an act of courage or an act of self-serving absolution? Did telling the truth 74 years later serve any purpose beyond easing his own conscience? Did his family and the families of the men he killed have a right to know the truth, even when that truth was devastating? These questions had no easy answers, and different people came to different conclusions based on their own values and beliefs about guilt, redemption, and the responsibilities we have to truth versus the responsibilities we have to preserve memories and honor the dead. For Robert's family, the revelation shattered their understanding of who he had been and forced them to hold space for contradictory truths, that he had done something terrible in 1945 and that he had been a loving, kind, devoted family man for the 74 years after. They struggled with how to remember him, how to honor the grandfather they had loved while acknowledging the young soldier who had killed his own wounded comrades. Some family members eventually came to see his confession as an act of courage that partially redeemed his earlier actions and his decades of deception, while others felt that confessing on his deathbed was too little too late and didn't constitute real accountability since he faced no consequences beyond the condemnation of those who learned his story. The final footage of Robert, recorded just days before his death, showed him saying, "I don't know if confessing helped anyone or if it just caused more pain. I don't know if the families of Danny, Thomas, and Andrew are glad to know the truth or wish I had kept it buried. I don't know if my family can forgive me or if they'll spend the rest of their lives struggling to reconcile the grandfather they loved with the soldier who killed his own men. What I do know is that carrying that secret for 74 years slowly destroyed me from the inside, that every time someone thanked me for my service or honored me as a hero, I felt like a fraud and a monster, and that dying without having told the truth felt impossible. I hope that wherever Danny, Thomas, and Andrew are, if consciousness continues in any form, they know that I'm sorry, that I've thought about them and what I did to them every single day for 74 years, and that I finally acknowledged the truth about how they died. I hope that counts for something, though I know it's not enough. It will never be enough, but it's all I have to offer.